performance on Twitter disinformation accounts. Okay, Aurora.
Is my PowerPoint up on screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as most of you probably know by now, I'm Aurora. I'm a third year PhD student at Cardiff University, and my presentation today is going to focus on the first two chapters of my thesis, and they aim to explore how metadata contributes to identity performances on Twitter disinformation accounts. Firstly, what is disinformation? William already gave us an amazing deep dive into this earlier, but disinformation is the intentional spread of information known to be false. So this differs from misinformation, where people might share things that are factually incorrect, but this might be because they really believe that it's true. So disinformation is intentional, misinformation is not. So disinformation is not a new phenomenon, but the affordances of the internet have meant that it's risen in prevalence as an issue in recent years, with one of the most notable examples being accusations of Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election. So the data that I use all comes from Twitter accounts that were run by the Internet Research Agency. I know they've been mentioned a couple of times already today, and they were a Russian company that operated troll farms where people operated disinformation accounts. And some of the accounts run by the Internet Research Agency ended up amassing a lot of followers, and they appeared in the mainstream media as evidence of public opinion. So this would suggest that at some level they had been believed to be true and real. And this is touched on in the indictment of 13 Russian nationals by the US government, who were accused of election interference. And the Internet Research Agency are named in this indictment. And in there it states that defendants and their co-conspirators regularly evaluated content posted to ensure they appeared authentic, as if operated by US persons. So we know that coming across as authentic was one of their aims. So what is authenticity? I approach authenticity as a dynamic process that's constantly being performed and negotiated, as opposed to a static quality of unquestionable realness. So instead of thinking, is this authentic or isn't it? I try to think about the context of the interaction and how that might influence people's perceptions of authenticity. So my literature review goes into a lot more detail about the theoretical background of the approach that I take. I don't have time to go into all of that now, but if anyone's interested, then please do ask me at the end. My approach is largely informed by Van Leeuwen and his suggestion that we should ask not whether something is authentic or not, but who takes this as authentic and who doesn't, and on the basis of which audible and visible cues are those judgments made. Here's an example of a disinformation account that I use in my sample, and this tweet from them was used in the Daily Mail as evidence of a row on social media and to suggest that there were social divisions following the Westminster terror attack. And after the account was outed as being a disinformation account, the media again responded and basically said that we'd all been fooled. And it was suggested by The Guardian that one of the reasons we'd been taken in by the account was because of the way that it looked. So because of the type of profile picture that it used and the type of information in its bio, The Guardian suggested that the account could have belonged to any one of millions of Donald Trump supporting Americans. So this contributes to the idea that the way that we present ourselves on social media and the type of information that we share has a direct influence on how believable our performances are perceived to be. And this led me to ask these questions. So how does the styling of usernames and handles on disinformation accounts contribute to authentication processes of identity performances? And then the same question targeted at profile pictures. So basically what I want to know is, how do the names and the pictures that people use influence how authentic they're perceived to be? So what is metadata? Metadata is data about data. In the context of Twitter, it's been suggested that metadata is anything other than a tweet itself. So things like the username, profile picture, the handle, and these are all things that I look at. And previous research suggests that this type of information does have an influence on how authentic and how credible we're perceived to be. But this research tends to focus on one specific context of Twitter use or another. So research into ordinary usage and ordinary users suggests that we see human names as being more authentic and credible than pseudonyms, and profile pictures that are photographs of humans as being more authentic and credible than cartoons, let's say. In comparison, in the context of false rumor spreading, it's been suggested that we attribute more credibility and authenticity to and are more influenced by accounts that look like news accounts. So while both of these types of research are really useful, there remains something of a gap where the potential for disinformation accounts to impersonate ordinary people remains relatively underexplored. And we know that this type of thing does happen because of the appearance of these types of accounts in the media and the reference to these types of accounts in the indictment. So I wanted to know what was going on with metadata in disinformation accounts. And to do this, I started off with access to nearly 4,000 accounts. And I filtered these so that they all use the English language and they all had over 5,000 followers. And this left me with 86 accounts. So out of those 86, I then chose 5 that I focus on throughout the thesis. So whenever I start off an analysis, I start out by doing a close-up analysis of these 5, and then I situate those findings within a wider sample. So some of the reasons that I chose these 5 were that they all had over 40,000 followers, they were engaged with a lot, they appeared in the mainstream media, and they were engaged with by high-profile figures. So Michael Flynn, the National Security Advisor at the time, and members of Trump's campaign team engaged with some of these accounts. So based on research into influence, that would suggest that at some level, these accounts were somewhat influential. So to get the wider sample that I situated those findings in, I split the remaining 81 accounts into more and comparatively less popular samples. And to do this, I again used research into the influencer industry. So I made the distinctions based on follower numbers. And the reason I did this was because I wanted to be able to see how the findings from my close-up analysis compared with other popular accounts. And I also wanted to be able to observe any differences between more and less popular accounts. So this presentation is mostly going to focus on those broader observations of the differences between more and less popular samples. To analyse handles and usernames, the first level of analysis that I undertook was to establish whether the names were eponyms or pseudonyms. So according to Chikala and Berkey, eponyms are real names, they're our first names, and we use them offline and they identify us as individuals. In contrast, pseudonyms are names that use any other type of identity aspect other than names. So things like our interests, our religion, our nationality, but wherever they are, they don't identify us as individuals. So I firstly established whether the handles and usernames were eponyms or pseudonyms, and then I labeled them for the identity aspects that were being presented. So here's an example of my coding strategy. So in the case of 10GOP, when contextualized by the username, 10 stands for Tennessee. So I coded this as being a pseudonym because there's no real name there. And because of the reference to Tennessee, I coded location. And then GOP is a way of referring to the Republican Party in the US. So I coded this as being political affiliation. The username is just Tennessee. So again, I coded this as being a pseudonym and location. In contrast, Pamela Moore is a real name. I coded this as being an eponym. And in any case where a first name was used, I looked up whether there was a gender dominance. And if there was, then I looked at whether the gender was dominantly feminine or masculine, and I coded it this way. If there was not a gender dominance in the names and the names were gender neutral, then I also coded for this. So once I'd coded all of the accounts and categories emerged, most of these are self-explanatory, but newsfeed I used to refer to accounts that use language in their handles and usernames that can be associated with the traditional genre of news sharing and newspapers. So if there was an account called Cardiff Today or the Cardiff Times, then I would code that as newsfeed because we associate those types of names with newspaper titles. I found that broadly the same identity aspects were being presented in handles and in usernames. So if location was being presented in the handle, most often it was also being presented in the username. And these locations would be the same places. So there were no examples of contradictory or conflicting information being presented in the handle and the corresponding username. And arguably, this contributes to authenticity using Van Leeuwen's approach of authenticity as truth to the essence of something, where he suggests that identity performances can be seen as authentic when they're constant and when they're unified. So arguably, these types of identity performances are being shown here, where the same identity aspects are being presented in different places. I also found that the more popular and less popular samples were performing identity in different ways. So in the more popular sample, the most common identity strategy, naming strategy, was pseudonyms, and within that, those that indexed location and newsfeed. So location and newsfeed often co-occurred, and this is shown in names like New York City Today. In contrast, in the less popular sample, the most common naming strategy and identity aspect was name, so eponyms, and this is shown in names like Dominic Valentine. So these findings can be linked back to previous research. So it was suggested that in the context of false rumor spreading, accounts that look like news are the most credible and authentic. And this is somewhat reflected in the more popular sample by the dominance of those types of news names. Amongst ordinary users, it would suggest that we attribute more authenticity and credibility to human names, and this is somewhat reflected in the less popular sample by the dominance of human names. So both types of previous research we can see being reflected here, but there seems to be a distinction based on the amount of followers that the accounts have. Next, I moved on to profile pictures, and I started out doing a close-up analysis of my 5. And to do this, I used Crescent Van Leeuwen's visual modality model and Ledden and Machin's 2018 adaptation of that model. So I looked at things like color saturation, gaze, pose, but in the wider sample, I just looked at identity aspects. So for example, in the case of South Lone Star, a person is being shown here, and this person indexes race and gender. So I coded for race and gender and then gave subcategorizations of white and masculine presenting. In comparison, in 10 GOP, there's not a person here. It's the state seal of Tennessee superimposed over the Confederate flag. So I coded this as showing location and political affiliation. So hopefully this helps to show how I coded profile pictures. But I found again that broadly the same identity aspects were being presented in profile pictures as in usernames and in handles. So if location was being shown in the naming strategies, then it was most commonly also being shown in the profile pictures. And I also found a orientation to two main types in profile pictures. So accounts that can be associated with news, shown by the dominance of location and newsfeed in the more popular sample, and accounts that looked more like personal accounts that could be associated with humans, and this is shown in the dominance of race and gender in the less popular sample. And in both of these types, there seems to be an orientation to pre-existing norms. So what I mean by that in the case of news branding is that the accounts that looked like news accounts and used news handles and usernames seemed to appropriate the norms of pre-existing and established news organizations. So for example, St. Louis Online, this is an account, a disinformation account from my dataset. And when we compare it to the verified BBC News UK profile picture, we can see some similarities. So they both use block colors, they both use a logo approach instead of showing a human, and the same information is repeated from the handles and the usernames in their profile pictures. So the most relevant information is repeated again for us. So this shows a similarity between the way that disinformation accounts use profile pictures and verified news organizations. I also found that there seem to be relationships between accounts, and this can be compared to the way that verified news organizations often have location-specific pages. So these three accounts were disinformation accounts. And when we compare this to CBS News, we can see that the three disinformation accounts share the same background color, the same text color, the same layout, and they also have the same structure in their naming, so location plus online. And when we compare this to the way that CBS has location-specific pages, we can see that the profile pictures are basically the same. The only thing that changes is the text signal in the location. I found that these same patterns weren't, and I found that there were 5 groups that could be formed of these groups in the more popular sample where there were these shared features. But I found that in the less popular sample, the same pattern couldn't really be observed, and norms weren't being appropriated in the same way. So for example, Atlanta Online in the less popular sample used the number 0 instead of the letter O. And we associate this often with text speak. We don't really expect it to be used in a professional capacity or by verified news organizations. And also there were no relationships between accounts. So in the less popular sample where there were news accounts, they tended to be standalone. In personal accounts, I found that most accounts using eponymous naming strategies used profile pictures that were photographs of humans. So one of the reasons that it suggested eponymous names are seen as more credible and authentic by ordinary users is because they create a link with the person's identity in the offline world. And arguably, the use of photographs of humans works the same way. So if we give our names and we show our faces, we're making ourselves less anonymous and we're identifying ourselves. And this idea that there might be a relationship between anonymity and credibility is reinforced in mainstream media and guides that tell us how to spot trolls and bad actors. So in a guide published by ABC News, it was stated that you should be wary of accounts that use celebrities or stock images as their profile pictures because they're anonymous and therefore less reliable. And we can see this being reflected by the presence of spoofs in the less popular sample. So by spoofs, I mean accounts that quite clearly aren't who they say they are. So for example, this is Jeb Lurie Bush, and this was in the less popular sample. And this was an account that posed as being a mashup between Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. So we can see in the profile picture that it's been photoshopped to show the features of both of those people kind of mashed together as one. But as an audience, we know that this isn't real. So we know that there's not a real person walking around in the world that looks like that. So these kind of accounts automatically are anonymous because we can't associate them with someone in the real world. And so the fact that these types of accounts appear in the less popular sample, but not the more popular one, would suggest that our expectations about anonymity are being reinforced in different ways in the more and the less popular samples. So to conclude, I suggest that authentication processes are contributed to Firstly, by consistent presentations across metadata units. So the fact that the same identity aspects are presented in profile pictures, handles, and usernames can be compared to Van Leeuwen's suggestion that authentic presentations are constant and unified. And I also suggest that the mirroring and reinforcement of pre-existing norms in both types of accounts influences authentication processes. So previous research tends to view one type of account as credible and authentic for another type of account, but I suggest that it's the extent to which accounts appropriate and reinforce existing norms that influences the authentication processes of their identity performances. So there are my references, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.